Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange and occasionally heroic world of medieval medicine, where getting sick was terrifying, getting treated was worse, and the person in charge of your recovery was fully convinced that the moon had strong opinions about your liver. We have got a patient who is about to discover what a physician's visit actually involved, which is less comfort and more philosophy about bile. We have got Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who wrote medical textbooks, composed music, advised popes, and apparently had enough hours in the day to personally reinvent several fields of human knowledge simultaneously. We have got an apothecary standing behind a counter full of things that smell wrong and cost too much, deciding in real time whether a specific combination of roots will cure you or simply end the argument. And we have got the hidden reality behind medieval medical theory itself, a system that was more coherent than people give it credit for, more dangerous than its practitioners would admit, and far stranger than anyone who has not looked closely would ever suspect. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You do not feel well. That is the beginning of everything. The single fact that puts everything else in motion. It started 2 days ago with a heaviness behind your eyes and a throat that felt like something was living in it. Yesterday the fever arrived, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the slow, confident way that fevers have when they are not planning to leave quickly. You sweated through the night, you drank water, and it did not help. You slept in fragments and woke feeling worse than when you closed your eyes. And now someone has decided that what you need is a physician. You're not sure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. In your village, a physician is not a common sight. Physicians are expensive, distant, and trained at universities in cities you have never visited, places where men argue about ancient texts in Latin and emerge years later with opinions about the human body that bear almost no relationship to anything you have personally experienced. What you know about physicians is mostly what people say. That they are learned, that they are serious, that they carry things in bags that smell strange, that they will, before doing anything else, need to look at your urine. You do not know yet how accurate that last part is. The physician arrives in the afternoon. He is not what you expected, though you are not entirely sure what you expected. He is middle-aged, composed, and carrying himself with a specific kind of calm that belongs to someone who has seen enough suffering that your particular variety does not disturb him. He sets down a leather bag, looks at you briefly, and begins asking questions in a tone that suggests the answers are less important than the framework he's already applying to your situation. How long have you had the fever? When did it begin? Is the heat constant, or does it come and go in waves? Do you feel heaviness in the left side or the right? Is your mouth bitter? Is your sleep troubled? Are your bowels moving correctly? That last question is delivered without embarrassment or apology, because in this world the bowels are not a delicate topic. They are a diagnostic tool, and they are expected to be reporting clearly. You answer as best you can. The physician listens with the patience of someone who is not actually listening to your words so much as translating them into a language you do not speak. Because what he is hearing is not just a description of symptoms, he is hearing evidence of an imbalance in your humours. This is the framework that governs everything he does, everything he believes, and everything he is about to do to you. The 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. In a healthy person, these 4 substances exist in balance, each one associated with a season, an element, a temperament, and a set of organs. Blood is warm and moist, belonging to spring, governed by the heart, and associated with a cheerful social disposition. Phlegm is cold and moist, belonging to winter, associated with the brain and a slow, calm nature. Yellow bile is warm and dry, belonging to summer, governed by the liver, and associated with ambition and irritability. Black bile is cold and dry, belonging to autumn, associated with the spleen and a tendency toward melancholy. When you're sick, the theory goes, it is because one of these humours has become excessive, deficient, or corrupt. The fever tells him something specific. The way your skin looks tells him something else. your tongue, your eyes, the colour beneath your fingernails, the heaviness you feel in your limbs, all of it is data pointing toward an imbalance that he is trained to identify and correct. Then comes the urine. He asks for it, and you provide it, in a small clay vessel that you hand over with the resigned dignity of someone who was warned this was coming. He holds it up to the light, a practice called uroscopy, which by this period is so central to medical diagnosis that physicians are sometimes depicted in paintings with a urine flask as their primary identifying symbol, the way a modern doctor might carry a stethoscope. He examines the colour, he notes the clarity, he considers the sediment, he may smell it, he will not taste it despite what some later satirists claimed about the practice, but he will look at it for longer than feels entirely comfortable for either of you. The colour tells him about the state of your digestion and your liver. The cloudiness suggests either infection or the presence of certain humours in excessive quantity. The sediment at the bottom, if there is any, indicates what your body is trying to expel. He cross-references what he sees with a urine wheel, a circular diagram that maps different appearances of urine to different diagnoses and recommended treatments, a document that some physicians carry and some have memorised. After the urine, he examines your pulse. Not the quick numerical pulse check of a modern doctor counting beats per minute, but something far more complex and interpretive. Medieval pulse diagnosis, drawing on ancient Greek and Arab sources, identifies dozens of different qualities in the pulse beyond just its speed. The pulse can be full or empty, hard or soft, quick or slow, regular or irregular, and each of these qualities in different combinations points toward different humoral states. He places 2 fingers on the inside of your wrist and remains very still for what feels like a very long time. You try not to breathe too loudly. He releases your wrist. He looks at the ceiling briefly, which is apparently where physicians keep their conclusions. Then he tells you what is wrong with you, and it is not quite what you expected. You have, in his assessment, an excess of yellow bile, heated and agitated by the summer season and by something you recently ate that was, in his view, too warm and too dry for your particular constitution. Your liver is labouring. Your digestion is generating too much heat. The fever is the result of your body attempting to burn off the excess, which is good in the sense that it shows the body is fighting, but which must be carefully managed, or the heat will corrupt the humour entirely rather than simply reducing it. This is the theory, and it is internally coherent. That is the thing about humoral medicine that is so easy to miss when you look at it from a distance. It is not random. It is not superstition pasted over ignorance. It is a complete system, with logic and structure and a long chain of reasoning connecting every symptom to every treatment. The problem is not that the reasoning is bad. The problem is that the foundational premises are wrong. But you do not know that. He does not know that. And so, you proceed. The first thing he recommends is a change in diet. This will happen before anything more active, because in humoral medicine, food is medicine, and the wrong food is disease. He instructs you to avoid anything warm and dry, which means meat, wine, and anything heavily spiced. He recommends cooling, moist foods instead. Barley water, boiled with a little honey, thin soups, cucumbers, which are cold and moist by nature, and which will help counteract the excess of hot yellow bile. He recommends that you rest in a cool room and avoid any strong emotion, because anger, which is itself hot and dry, will feed the very imbalance he's trying to correct. You nod at all of this because you're feverish and in no position to argue, and because honestly, cool broth and rest sounds manageable. You had feared something worse. Something worse is coming. After the dietary instructions, he reaches into his bag. He produces a small set of tools, and you recognise them immediately because everyone recognises them, even if you have never seen them used on you specifically. The lancet is small, narrow, and very sharp. The bowl is ceramic, shallow, and has clearly been used before. He is going to bleed you. Bloodletting is the most commonly used active treatment in medieval medicine, and it is not a fringe practice, not something only desperate or ignorant physicians do. It is mainstream, well documented, and endorsed by every major medical authority from ancient Greece through the medieval Arab world and into the European universities where this man was trained. The logic is the same logic governing everything else he does. If you have an excess of a humour, you remove it. If that humour is blood, or if the blood has become hot and agitated and is carrying the corruption with it, then you remove blood and the body rebalances and health follows. There is a correct vein for every illness. He has studied this. The veins of the arm are used for conditions originating in the upper body. Veins behind the ear are associated with head complaints. The liver vein, inside the right arm, is indicated for conditions the physician believes involve hepatic imbalance. He selects the appropriate site with care, because selecting the wrong vein is not just unhelpful, it can, by his understanding, make the problem worse by drawing the corrupt humour in the wrong direction through the body. He also consults the almanac, not because he believes in astrology in the popular sense, not because he is looking at the stars for personal guidance, but because the medical calendar in this era is genuinely astronomical. The zodiac governs the body in a system called melathesia, in which each sign of the zodiac rules a specific part of the body. Aries rules the head, Taurus rules the neck and throat, Gemini governs the arms and shoulders, and the rule is simple and very serious. You do not bleed a part of the body when the moon is passing through the sign that governs it. To do so is considered actively dangerous, an invitation to increased blood loss, corruption, and death. He has checked. The moon is in a safe position. He proceeds. The lancet is quick, at least. A small, practiced cut over the vein inside your arm, sharp enough that you feel the sting before you quite understand it has happened. He holds the bowl beneath the cut and watches. The blood comes steadily at first, then slows as the bowl collects what he considers the appropriate amount. How much is appropriate depends on the patient's constitution, the severity of the illness, the season, and the judgment of the physician. Some patients were bled minimally, a few ounces at most. Others, in more severe cases, lost quantities that a modern physician would consider genuinely alarming. You feel the familiar slight dizziness that follows, a lightness in the head that might be mistaken for relief if you did not also feel slightly less solid than you did a few minutes ago. The physician watches your colour, checks your pulse again, and decides he has what he needs. He binds the cut with a strip of clean linen, gives you precise instructions about watching the wound for any unusual heat or swelling, and tells you to rest. Then he writes out a prescription. It is not the one-line scripts of the modern world. It is a detailed document in Latin specifying a compound remedy he wants prepared by the apothecary in the village. The remedy contains, among other things, theriac, a wildly complex compound that includes dozens of ingredients and has been considered a near-universal antidote and treatment since ancient times. It also contains a cooling herb, ground and prepared in a specific way. It contains a small amount of something astringent to support the liver. It contains honey, because honey is warming in small amounts and helps carry the other ingredients through the digestive tract. He hands you the document and tells you the apothecary will know what to do with it. He does not tell you the price of the remedy in advance, because the price is, by this point, the apothecary's problem to communicate. He leaves with the composed air of someone who has done everything correctly, and he has, by the standards of his world and his training. He has taken a thorough history, performed a careful examination, identified a plausible diagnosis within the accepted framework, and prescribed a graduated treatment that moves from the least invasive to the more active. He has avoided the most dangerous excesses of his time. He has not recommended things that are obviously going to kill you faster. What he has not done is make you better, but you do not know that yet, and neither does he, and so the transaction feels complete. You lie back against your thin pillow, arm throbbing gently, head still heavy with the fever. The room is quieter now. Someone has placed a cup of barley water beside you, just as instructed. You take a careful sip. It is warm and slightly bland, and has the flavour of something that wishes it were something else entirely. You think about the physician, about the way he held your wrist, about the urine flask lifted against the window light, his eyes narrowing slightly in concentration, as though what he was reading there was genuinely important information, about the confidence with which he described your liver and your yellow bile and your constitutional warmth, as if he had simply gone inside and looked and come back with an accurate report. There was something real in that confidence, something that went beyond performance. He believed it. And in believing it, he brought something that is not nothing to a bedside that could have received nothing at all. He brought attention. He brought a framework. He brought the sense that your suffering had been seen and categorized, and was now being addressed. Whether the framework was correct is, at this moment, almost beside the point. You close your eyes. The barley water sits cooling on the table beside you. Somewhere outside, a bird is doing something optimistic. Your fever still runs its quiet program beneath your skin, unbothered by the consultation, indifferent to the bloodletting, largely unmoved by the philosophical argument about your bile. But you feel, if not better, then at least witnessed. And in a world where the alternative to a physician is nothing at all, or worse, something considerably more alarming than a man with a urine flask that turns out to matter more than it should. The physician has been gone for an hour when the real question settles in quietly, the one that has been circling the room since he arrived, whether anything he did was going to help, and the honest answer, the one that no one in this century would say aloud, is that your recovery depends far less on the humoral theory of your physician than on the quiet workings of a body that is, even now, doing everything it can to fix what went wrong. Your immune system, which he has no word for, is already engaged. The fever itself, which he views primarily as a symptom to be managed, is doing real biological work, raising your internal temperature to a level that makes it harder for the pathogen to replicate. The bloodletting has not helped. That much is simply true, but it has not, in a case like yours, killed you either, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about it. You are not severe enough to be bled into a crisis. You're sick enough to receive the full treatment, but stable enough to survive it, which puts you in exactly the right category of medieval patient, the category that gets treated, recovers, and remembers the physician kindly. You drift toward a light, uncomfortable sleep. Outside, the summer air moves through the window, carrying something that smells faintly of the fields. Your fever does its work. Your body does its work. The physician's theory does what theories do when they are wrong but not catastrophically so. It provides a container for the experience, a shape for the suffering. And somewhere down the lane, the apothecary is already reading the prescription, squinting at the Latin, reaching for the theriac. Before the physician arrives, there is the waiting, and the waiting is its own form of suffering in a world that has no reliable way to shorten it. You lie in your bed, which is a straw mattress covered by a linen sheet, and you listen to the sounds of the house moving around you without your participation. Someone is doing something with water downstairs. Someone else has gone out and come back in. A door opens, a door closes. None of it involves you, because you have been placed in the category of the unwell, which in this world is a category with fairly clear social rules attached to it. And the main rule is that you stay where you are and do not create additional work for people who are already working. Your fever has its own rhythm, which you have been tracking with the involuntary attention of someone with nothing else to do. It rises in the afternoon, peaking somewhere in the late hours of the day, when the air in the room feels thick and your skin is simultaneously burning and crawling. It drops in the early morning, not completely, but enough that you can distinguish between the heavy fire of the afternoon and the dull smoulder of dawn, and in that distinction you find a small, unreliable hope. If it comes and goes, it might go entirely. This is the logic of the sick, which is not exactly wrong, but is also not exactly reliable. Your throat is worse than yesterday. The swallowing that was uncomfortable on the first day is now something you negotiate before you attempt it. Planning the movement, waiting for the right moment, doing it quickly as if speed will reduce the consequence. It does not. Someone has left a cup of water beside you, and you look at it with a complicated mixture of desire and reluctance, knowing you need it, and knowing also that drinking it is going to cost you something. You take small sips. You pace yourself. You are becoming, without intending to, an expert in the management of your own discomfort, which is not the expertise anyone seeks but which the sick body teaches reliably. The room itself contributes to the experience in ways you would not have thought to consider when you were well. The light comes in at a specific angle in the morning and changes through the day. You have memorized this without trying. The ceiling has a knot in one of the beams that you have been staring at during the periods when sleep does not come, and you know its exact shape now. It's split on the left side, and the pale oval where the wood dried differently. When you are well, you do not notice ceilings. When you are sick, the ceiling becomes one of the primary landscapes of your days. The smell of the room is yours now, the slightly sharp smell of fever sweat, the underlying smell of straw and wood and old linen that belongs to the building. When you are well, you do not notice this smell either. The sick notice everything. because they have removed themselves from the world of action and are left with only the world of sensation, and sensation has to go somewhere. Someone brings you food mid-morning. It is a thin soup, mostly broth with soft vegetables that have been cooked long enough to present no challenge to a throat in revolt. You eat some of it slowly, holding the bowl with both hands because the heat of it is one of the few reliably pleasant things available to you right now. The soup is not remarkable. It is exactly what it needs to be, which is warm and soft and present when you need it. And the person who made it understood this, which means they understand more about what you need than they would ever frame as knowledge. You sleep in fragments. This is the sleep of the ill, which is not quite sleep and not quite waking, but something in between that leaves you feeling neither rested nor alert, just suspended. You drift into something that might be a dream and drift back out of it before you can hold on to the content. You're dimly aware of the sounds of the house during these intervals, the way they come in and out of focus, present then muffled, then present again. In one of these half-dreams, or perhaps it is fully waking and simply feels like dreaming because your brain is processing at less than its usual capacity, you think about the last time you were sick. It was a different kind of sick, shorter and less interesting, resolved in 2 days by rest and warmth and nothing else. This one is more serious and you know it, and the knowledge sits in you quietly without panic, which is its own form of grace. Panic would make everything worse. What you have instead is a steady, watchful waiting, the body's way of saying that it is dealing with something significant, and it needs you to stay out of the way while it works. This is the actual medicine, of course, the rest that your body insists on, the withdrawal from effort that the sick chamber enforces whether the patient wishes it or not. The warmth of the bed against the fever's chills and the heat, the liquids that someone keeps bringing, understanding without being told that the body needs them, the watching of the knot in the ceiling beam and the patience that the watching requires. All of this is doing something real, and it was doing something real long before anyone had a theory about why. The physician arrives in the early afternoon, having apparently been informed by whoever manages these things that a patient is waiting. He comes with the composed efficiency of someone for whom this visit is one of several today, and you feel the specific and slightly undignified hope of the sick in the presence of authority. The hope that is almost indistinguishable from relief just at the sight of someone who is supposed to know what to do. He moves through his examination with the practiced routine of his training. The urine examination takes longer than you expected. He holds the flask up, tilts it, holds it against the light from the window, tilts it again. His expression does not change, but his eyes do, narrowing slightly, tracking something in the liquid that you cannot see from where you lie. Whatever he reads there, he reads it carefully. He looks at your tongue. He asks you to open your mouth and he holds a candle near it and looks for something specific, the colour and texture of the tongue being part of the diagnostic picture in humoral medicine, an indicator of the state of the stomach and the blood. Your tongue is, he observes with a clinical neutrality, somewhat coated. This tells him something. He stores the information alongside everything else he's collecting. He examines your skin. Not cursorily, but methodically, looking at the colour of your face, the colour at the edges of your eyes, the state of your complexion. In humoral medicine, the skin is a visible report from the interior, the body's external surface reflecting what is happening in its depths. Redness, pallor, yellowness, each has its diagnostic meaning within the system. You're somewhat flushed, which might mean excess of blood or heat, or might be simply the fever doing what fevers do. The pulse examination is the longest. He holds your wrist with a specific stillness, not gripping but resting his fingers with a precision that is clearly the result of training. He counts, but he does more than count. He feels for qualities that a modern clinician would not be assessing: the character of the pulse's force, its rhythm, its depth, its texture. A hard pulse is different from a soft one. A bounding pulse is different from a thready one. The language of medieval pulse diagnosis contains many more distinctions than modern medicine makes routine use of, and he is applying them all. You watch his face during this. There is something like satisfaction there, very controlled, very professional, but there, the satisfaction of someone who is seeing what they expected to see and can now proceed with confidence. His diagnosis is taking shape. When he speaks He speaks slowly and with a precision that suggests he has thought about how to communicate this to a non-physician in terms that will produce compliance without producing panic. The excess of yellow bile, heated and agitated. The liver working too hard against the summer heat and against a diet that has not, apparently, suited your constitution. The fever as the body's attempt to resolve the imbalance, which is good, which shows the body is not passive, but which must be guided rather than simply allowed to proceed unchecked. The diet changes are the first intervention, and you listen carefully because this is the part you can actually affect with your own behaviour. No meat for at least a week. No wine, which in practice means no wine at all, because wine is warming. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Plenty of boiled barley water, sweetened lightly with honey, which is cooling by its nature and will help the body find its way back to balance. Soft cooked vegetables. Fish, carefully prepared, which occupies a cooler position in the humoral hierarchy than meat does. Small amounts of food at regular intervals rather than one large meal, because a large meal taxes the digestive heat, and you need your digestive system working gently rather than effortfully. He also recommends the room be kept cool, which given the summer heat is a request that will require someone to manage the window carefully throughout the day, allowing air in the morning and closing against the afternoon heat. He recommends calm and quiet, which the sickroom already provides, but which becomes, now that he has named it, something with the weight of prescription. No strong emotions, no loud sounds, no troubling news. The humours are sensitive to emotional experience, which in Hildegard's framework, and in the larger tradition of medieval medicine, is not metaphorical but physiological. Anger warms the blood. Fear moves the humours unpredictably. Grief thickens and chills. The emotional life is part of the medical situation. The bloodletting follows after the dietary discussion, not as a surprise but as the expected next step, the thing you knew was coming from the moment you heard the word physician. He prepares the lancet and the bowl with the movements of someone who has performed this hundreds of times, quick and economical, not casual but not ceremonial either. Just work, practiced until it became as ordinary as any other work. The incision is genuinely fast. That is one of its few mercies. The discomfort is less than you expected and more lingering than you hoped. You feel the warmth of your own blood in the bowl beneath your arm and you try not to think about it too specifically. He watches the flow and makes his assessment, drawing on a calculus of factors that you do not have access to: your apparent constitution, the stage of your illness, the season, the quantity that the presentation suggests is appropriate. He stops when he stops, and the bandaging of the wound is quick and firm, the linen wrapped and tied with a professional competence that is also, in its way, a form of care. He gives you instructions about the wound with the specificity of someone who knows that patients do not always follow instructions and is trying to make the important ones memorable. Watch for increasing redness around the site. Watch for warmth that is different from the warmth of the fever, more localized, more intense. If the wound weeps beyond the first day, have someone send for him. These are the signs of wound corruption, which he cannot explain in terms that would translate to modern microbiology, but which he has seen enough times to recognize and take seriously. He writes the prescription with a small pot of ink and a pen that he carries in his bag, and the Latin flows from him quickly because he has written this kind of prescription many times before, and the formula is partly memorized and partly adjusted for the specifics of this patient. The apothecary will read it without difficulty. The Latin of prescriptions has its own specialized vocabulary, and apothecaries of any competence have learned it as part of their training. He collects his things with the same efficiency with which he unpacked them, and at the door he pauses briefly and tells you, in a tone that is warm but measured, that you will recover. Not certainly, not guaranteeing anything, but as an assessment based on what he has observed, delivered in a way that is neither falsely reassuring nor needlessly alarming. You will recover. Take the remedies. Follow the diet. Rest. Do not work before you feel ready. He has seen worse, and he has seen those patients recover as well. Then he's gone, and the room is quieter than it was before he arrived, which is both a relief and a slight deflation, the way any intense attention leaves a space when it withdraws. You lie back and consider what just happened, which is that a man came and looked at you very carefully with tools you could not evaluate for accuracy, drew some blood from your arm and told you to eat soup, and this is the best available care in your world for what ails you. And it is, for all its limitations, not nothing. It is something. You reach for the barley water someone left. It is cooling now, no longer quite warm but not cold either, and the honey in it is just present enough to take the edge off the flatness of the grain. You drink it slowly. Outside the window, the summer afternoon is doing what summer afternoons do, occupying the air with heat and insect noise, and the occasional sound of something being done in a nearby yard. You exist inside this afternoon at a slight remove from it, the way the sick exist at a slight remove from everything, watching the world continue its business from behind the transparent wall of their own reduced capacity. Your body continues its work. The fever keeps its rhythm. The blood that was taken is already being replaced by processes no one in this century can name or trace. The bone marrow doing its quiet and constant labour. The blood renewing itself from interior stores with a completeness that would have surprised the physician who was so carefully removing some of it. You do not know any of this. You only know that the afternoon light is moving across the ceiling and you are tired and the soup was warm, and someone will bring more barley water when the cup is empty. That is enough. That has to be enough. And remarkably, in more cases than the simplest telling of the story would suggest it was. There is a specific kind of person who appears in history at irregular intervals, someone who operates at such a different scale from the people around them that later generations always suspect the record must be exaggerating. Hildegard of Bingen was one of these people, and the record in her case is not exaggerating. It is simply describing someone who genuinely did that much. She was born in the year 1098, the 10th child of a noble family in the Rhineland region of what is now Western Germany. Being the 10th child in a noble medieval family meant something specific in that era. It meant that you were, in a quiet and practical sense, a surplus. Not unloved, not unvalued, but available in a way that older children with clear inheritance functions were not. The church offered a solution that many families of this period used readily. Hildegard was given to God at the age of 8, placed in the care of a Benedictine anchoress named Jutta of Sponheim, who lived attached to the monastery of Disibodenberg in a small enclosure where she pursued a life of prayer and instruction. This was a form of religious life that looked, from the outside, like complete withdrawal from the world. Jutta and the young girl lived in extreme simplicity, praying the canonical hours, studying scripture, learning the basics of Latin, and maintaining a silence that the theology of the time associated with closeness to God. It was meant to be a complete life, entire within its walls, needing nothing from the world beyond. But Hildegard was already beginning to complicate the picture. She had been seeing visions since childhood. Not the terrifying convulsive visions of later mystical tradition, not the dramatic prostrations and heavenly fire that some saints described. Her visions were, by her own account, experienced while fully awake, with her eyes open, alongside her ordinary sensory perception of the world. She called it the living light, or sometimes the reflection of the living light, a quality of illumination that she distinguished carefully from ordinary vision and from dream. It was, she insisted, not something that overtook her, it was something that coexisted with her. For decades, she kept this almost entirely to herself. The visions were constant. They had been with her since she was small, but she did not speak of them publicly, did not write them down, did not build a public identity around them. She absorbed what she saw and heard in the visions with the quiet discipline of someone who understood that claiming divine revelation was not a thing you announced lightly in the medieval world. You needed authority before you opened that door. You needed standing. You needed, ideally, a letter from a pope. Jutta died in the year 1136, and Hildegard, now in her late 30s, was elected as the leader of the small community of women that had gathered around Jutta's enclosure. She was by this point educated, experienced, and trusted. She understood the scriptures, the rule of St. Benedict, the liturgical calendar, the basics of natural philosophy and medicine that formed part of any serious monastic education. She had spent nearly 30 years learning in silence, and she was about to stop being silent. In 1141, she described receiving a direct command. The voice that came to her in the living light told her to write, not to speak, not to advise privately, not to share in the careful, circumscribed way that was available to women in religious communities, but to write publicly and to share what she had been shown. She was 42 years old. She had been carrying these visions for more than 3 decades, and now she was being told to release them. She was terrified. This is the part of the story that tends to get smoothed over, the part where the visionary saint becomes ill with the effort of resistance, where the uncertainty and the fear are real and physical and not just dramatic literary convention. Hildegard wrote later that she felt ill during the period of her hesitation, struck down by a sickness she associated directly with her failure to obey the command she had received. When she began to write, the illness eased. She took this as confirmation. She began dictating her visions to a monk named Volmar, who helped her with the Latin, and to a young nun named Richardis, who transcribed. The result, after 10 years of careful work, was a book called Civias, which is short for a Latin phrase meaning "know the ways of the Lord." It is one of the most extraordinary documents of the medieval period. It contains 26 visions, each one described in vivid architectural cosmological detail, each one followed by a theological explanation that Hildegard presents as the direct meaning given to her, along with the vision itself. The imagery is dense, specific, and strange in ways that feel unlike the conventional religious art of the period. Towers of fire, a figure of extraordinary brightness surrounded by concentric circles, the mountain of God, seen from a perspective that somehow includes both the summit and the interior. The images feel less like illustrations of existing doctrine and more like reports from somewhere that existing doctrine had not fully mapped. She sent the manuscript to Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential theological voice in Europe at the time, asking him to read it and assess whether it was genuine. This was not false modesty, it was practical strategy. Bernard's endorsement would provide the protection she needed to publish without being immediately accused of heresy or delusion. Bernard, somewhat surprisingly given the scale and strangeness of what she had sent him, wrote back with qualified approval. He acknowledged her as a genuine visionary and advised her to proceed. 2 years later, at the Synod of Trier, Pope Eugenius III read excerpts from Civias aloud, with Bernard present. The Pope endorsed Hildegard's work and gave his explicit approval for her to continue writing and publishing. A woman, in the 12th century, received a papal mandate to produce theological texts. It was the kind of thing that did not happen, and it happened anyway, which tells you something about Hildegard and something about the force with which she operated in the world. But Civias was only the beginning, because Hildegard, having finally opened the door that she had spent 30 years walking past, was not going to open only one room. The medical texts came next, and they represent something genuinely remarkable. Physica and Causae et Curae are 2 volumes, sometimes treated as one work, that amount to a comprehensive natural history and medical treatise. Physica describes the properties of plants, stones, fish, birds, animals, metals, and elements, each one considered from the perspective of its natural qualities and its effect on human health. Causae et Curae is more specifically medical, describing causes of illness, the nature of the humours, the workings of the human body, and treatments for hundreds of specific conditions. The framework is humoral, as it would be for any learned person of this period. Hildegard did not overturn Galenic medicine or propose a new theoretical system. What she did was something different. She brought to the humoral framework an extraordinarily detailed and evidently experiential knowledge of specific remedies. Plant by plant, stone by stone, she described what things do when applied to a sick body, drawing on a combination of ancient sources, the accumulated knowledge of her monastic community's herb garden and infirmary, and her own observations over decades of caring for the sick. Some of her remedies are recognisably sensible by modern standards. She recommended fennel for digestive complaints, which is still used for the same purpose. She recommended spelt over wheat as more digestible, a claim that has attracted interest from modern researchers. She noted the properties of lavender and used it for headaches and calming of the spirit, as it is still used today. She wrote about the importance of moderate diet, fresh air, adequate sleep, and emotional equilibrium in maintaining health, positions that a modern physician would find entirely reasonable. Other remedies are considerably stranger. She recommended pressing a live hen against a tumour in order to draw out the corruption, the heat of the bird transferring healing warmth into the affected tissue. She described treatments involving grinding specific gemstones into powder and administering them in water or wine. She wrote about the curative properties of powdered gold and emerald, a practice that sounds purely magical until you consider that the use of mineral compounds in medicine has a long actual history, and that some mineral preparations do have measurable biological effects, even if not quite the ones she described. What distinguishes Hildegard from many of her contemporaries is not the modernity of her conclusions, but the specificity of her attention. She looked at things carefully. She described what she observed rather than simply repeating what ancient authorities had said, and she brought to her writing a clarity that suggests someone who has actually seen the sick recover, or fail to recover, who has actually worked with these plants and these preparations, who is reporting something real rather than copying inherited text. She also wrote about what we might now recognise as conditions of the mind. She described what sounds like depression, what sounds like grief sickness, what sounds like states of spiritual despair that manifested in physical symptoms. She took these seriously as medical conditions, not merely as spiritual failures. She recommended specific interventions, herbs, rest, human company, prayer, moderate work, and the maintenance of routine. The underlying assumption is that the person who is suffering in this way is genuinely ill and deserves care, not judgment. This was, in its quiet way, a significant position. She also wrote music, 77 musical compositions, more than any other composer of the medieval period whose work survives, and she wrote both the words and the melodies, which was itself unusual. Her music is unlike anything else from the 12th century. Where most liturgical music of the period moves in relatively contained ranges, Hildegard's melodies leap and soar across spans that trained singers today still find demanding. They feel, even to a modern ear, like they are doing something specific, like they are shaped around a particular kind of emotional and physical experience of sound in the body. She wrote that music was medicine, not metaphorically. She believed that the right sounds in the right order had direct physiological effects on the human body, that the vibration of the voice in sacred song could restore a kind of original harmony that the body had lost when humanity fell from grace. The theology is medieval, but the intuition, that sound and vibration have measurable effects on the nervous system and the experience of pain and distress, is something that researchers in the modern period have been exploring seriously. She founded a new monastery. At the age of 50, having spent her entire adult life at Disibodenberg, she received another vision instructing her to move her community to a new location on the banks of the Rhine, a place called Rupertsberg. The abbot of Disibodenberg was not pleased. Her community of women was, by this point, a source of significant income for his monastery, and losing them was losing revenue. Hildegard wrote to him, negotiated with him, and when he refused to cooperate, she fell ill again. The illness once again she associated with obstruction of divine will. The abbot, perhaps wisely, eventually relented. She moved the community. She built the new monastery from almost nothing. She managed the finances, negotiated the land rights, secured the necessary ecclesiastical permissions, oversaw the construction, and continued writing throughout. Then, a decade later, she founded a second monastery at Eibingen across the river. She also travelled. 4 times in her 50s and 60s she undertook preaching tours through the Rhineland, speaking publicly at churches and cathedral chapters to audiences of clergy and laity. This was extraordinary. Women did not preach in public in the 12th century church. The prohibition was explicit and widely observed. Hildegard preached anyway, and no one stopped her, which suggests that her combination of papal endorsement, personal force, and the evident authenticity of her public presence made the usual rules difficult to enforce. She wrote to kings, she wrote to emperors, she wrote to Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, and told him that his policies were problematic. She wrote to Pope Anastasius IV and told him that he was governing the church poorly and needed to correct his course. She wrote to Thomas Becket during the crisis between him and Henry II of England, offering spiritual counsel. Her letters are not diplomatic in the conventional sense. They are direct, sometimes alarming in their directness, written in the voice of someone who is not angling for position, but delivering what she believes is a genuine message that the recipient needs to hear. She was not always right. Some of her political advice was not taken, and history does not record that the world suffered particularly for its absence. Some of her medical recommendations would have done nothing, or worse. She was operating within a system that had real limits, and the limits affected her conclusions whether she acknowledged them or not. But she did something that very few people in any century managed to do. She built a complete intellectual world, fully internally consistent, drawing on everything available to her, pushing against the edges of what her position and her period allowed, and then she lived in that world for 9 decades, and left records of it detailed enough that we can still read them and feel something like the shape of her mind. She died in 1179 at the age of 81, having completed 3 major theological works, 2 medical texts, a book on natural history, 77 musical compositions, and somewhere between 300 and 400 letters to some of the most powerful figures in Europe. She had founded 2 monasteries and outlived most of the people who had tried to stop her. The process for her canonization was begun almost immediately after her death, and then stalled for reasons that are not entirely clear, and that feel, in hindsight, like the usual institutional inertia meeting something it was not quite sure how to classify. She was finally declared a Doctor of the Church in 2012, the 4th woman in history to receive that title, which means that the Catholic Church has officially recognized her as a theologian of sufficient importance and orthodoxy that her work carries genuine teaching authority. 800 years after she died. But then, institutions move at their own pace. Hildegard, who spent 30 years waiting before she began to write, would probably understand. There is something worth returning to about the visions themselves, because the temptation is to either dismiss them entirely or to treat them as the central miraculous fact around which everything else in Hildegard's life is arranged, and neither of those approaches quite gets it right. What makes Hildegard interesting as a thinker is not the visions in isolation. It is the relationship between the visions and the extraordinary, disciplined intellectual work she brought to everything else. She did not use the visions as a substitute for thinking. She used them alongside thinking, as a different kind of access to questions that she was also approaching through her reading, her observation, and her experience. Modern scholars have proposed a number of explanations for the nature of her visions, the most commonly repeated being that she may have experienced migraine with aura, a neurological condition that produces precisely the kind of luminous visual disturbances that Hildegard described in her accounts. The stars and lights, the shimmering edges, the way the vision coexists with ordinary perception rather than replacing it. These are recognizable symptoms of a specific neurological event, and Oliver Sacks, the neurologist and writer, wrote about this connection with care in his book on migraine, noting the parallels between Hildegard's descriptions and the experiences of his patients. This is interesting. It's also not the whole story, because even if the visual element of her experience had a neurological substrate, what Hildegard did with that experience was an act of sustained intellectual labour that neurological events alone cannot account for. She was interpreting, organising, writing, and defending the content of her visions in ways that required knowledge, judgment, and the kind of rigorous engagement with theological tradition that comes from decades of study. The vision might have been the door. What she brought through the door was Hildegard. Her cosmological thinking is perhaps the most ambitious part of her writing, and the least known. She developed a view of the universe as alive, as a vast organism animated by the same force that animated the human body, a concept she called viriditas, which is usually translated as greenness or greening power. Viriditas is the life force, the moisture and vitality that flows through creation, that makes plants grow and seasons turn and human bodies remain functional. When a plant withers, it has lost its viriditas. When a person grows ill and weak, something similar is happening, the life force is diminished. This is not Galenic humoral theory. It is something different, something that Hildegard seems to have developed from her own engagement with the natural world rather than purely from texts. The medicinal properties she ascribes to plants are often described in terms of their viriditas, their specific quality of this life force, and how it interacts with the human body's version of the same. The framework is theological, rooted in the idea that creation is a gift whose properties are designed to sustain the creature, but it produces a way of thinking about plants and bodies and their interactions that is not simply repetition of ancient authority. She was also unusual in her attention to what we might call the psychological dimensions of physical illness. The Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, the great Arab physician whose work was widely read in European universities, did acknowledge the relationship between emotional states and physical health. but this remained somewhat marginal in the mainstream Galenic framework. Hildegard moved it toward the centre. Her descriptions of illness include attention to the emotional and spiritual state of the patient as a significant contributing factor, not as a metaphor, but as something she believed operated physiologically. A person who lived in chronic fear would develop certain physical imbalances. A person who was chronically angry would develop others. The body was not separate from the life that was lived in it. This position has considerable modern resonance. The field that contemporary researchers call psychoneuroimmunology, the study of the connections between psychological states, the nervous system, and immune function, is producing findings that are recognizable echoes of what Hildegard was describing in theological and humoral language. The stress hormones that suppress immune function, the inflammatory pathways that chronic emotional distress upregulates. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The way psychological states translate into physical vulnerability. Hildegard did not understand any of this mechanistically, but she was watching the same phenomena and taking them seriously in an era when most medical thinking separated mind and body more completely than she did. Her correspondence with Frederick Barbarossa represents one of the more remarkable documents in the history of the relationship between religious authority and temporal power. Frederick was the Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe, engaged in a prolonged and increasingly ugly conflict with the papacy that would eventually require him to make multiple expeditions into Italy, and that consumed decades of his political life. He was not accustomed to receiving letters that told him he was wrong. Hildegard wrote to him in terms that were respectful in their form and uncompromising in their content. She told him that his current path was leading toward ruin. She described, in the language of vision, the consequences that would follow from policies she considered unjust. She called him, in the diplomatically cushioned but unmistakably direct terms of prophetic address, to reconsider. She was an elderly abbess writing to the most powerful secular ruler in Europe with advice he had not solicited, and he wrote back, not to dismiss her, but to respond, to engage, to take the correspondence seriously. This tells you something about her reputation by this stage of her life, which was sufficient that ignoring her would have been a different kind of problem than acknowledging her, but it also tells you something about her. She was not writing to him because she thought he would listen. She was writing to him because she believed it was her obligation to say what she saw, and the consequence for her of not saying it was worse than the consequence of saying it and being ignored. That is a specific kind of courage, and it persisted through her 9th decade without apparent diminishment. Her last major controversy came when she was in her 80s. A young man who had been excommunicated had, at some earlier point, been buried in the graveyard of her monastery at Rupertsberg, apparently having been reconciled to the church before his death. The ecclesiastical authorities of the region ordered that his body be exhumed and removed from sacred ground, on the grounds that his original excommunication remained technically in force. Hildegard refused. She had her own records of the young man's reconciliation, and she considered the order unjust. The consequences were swift. Her community was placed under an interdict, which meant that they were forbidden from celebrating the liturgy, singing the divine office, or receiving the sacraments. For a monastic community whose entire life was organised around communal prayer and liturgical practice, this was not merely a bureaucratic inconvenience, it was a suspension of the central purpose of everything they did. Hildegard wrote immediately to the Archbishop of Mainz, under whose authority the interdict had been issued. She wrote with the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake, not just for her community but for herself, because an elderly abbess who defied ecclesiastical authority was in a potentially serious position. But she also wrote with the absolute confidence of someone who believed she was right, who had spent a lifetime operating with that belief, and who was not going to recant it now. The interdict was eventually lifted. The records of the young man's reconciliation were reviewed and found satisfactory. Hildegard's community returned to their singing. She was in her mid-80s. She died in September of 1179. The obituary notices that followed, written by those who had known her or known of her, struggled with the task of summarising a life that had produced so much in so many different directions. The theologian and the naturalist, and the physician and the composer, and the abbess and the correspondent of kings, and the founder of monasteries were the same person, and that person had been doing all of it simultaneously for 40 years without apparent awareness that any of it was unusual. It was unusual. It remains unusual. The quantity and range of what she produced would be remarkable in any era. In an era that provided almost no infrastructure for women's intellectual work, no university access, no expectation of publication, no tradition of women corresponding with emperors about geopolitics, it is something that does not quite have a category. She built the category herself and then filled it completely. The music is perhaps the most direct surviving evidence of what she was actually like, because music is harder to paraphrase or explain than writing, and in some ways more resistant to misappropriation by later interpreters who want to make it mean what they need it to mean. The recordings that exist of her compositions, performed by groups who have worked carefully with the original manuscripts, are disorienting to listen to with contemporary ears. They do not sound like the 12th century. They do not sound like any period. They sound like someone who was hearing something specific and writing it down as accurately as they could, and what they were hearing was not quite what anyone else was hearing. Whether that was the living light she described, or the particular configuration of a remarkable mind working within the materials of its time, or both of those things simultaneously and inseparably, is a question that honest scholarship holds open. It is probably not the most useful question. The more useful question is what the work does, which is that it persists, across 8.5 centuries, still recognisable as the product of a single, identifiable, irreducibly strange human intelligence doing its best with what it had, which was, in her case, very nearly everything. The apothecary's afternoon does not end with the young man buying the preparation for alertness. There is more to it than the official business, more to any given day in this shop than the prescriptions and the straightforward transactions. There is the knowledge that circulates in other ways through conversation and instruction, and the slow transfer of information between people who work with their hands and learn through repetition rather than through texts. The woman who comes in late in the afternoon past the busiest hours does not come with a prescription or a specific request. She comes to talk, she's a midwife, and she has a question about a specific preparation that she's been using for years, a combination of herbs that she recommends to women in the early days after childbirth to support the uterus in its recovery, to ease the cramping that follows delivery, to promote the flow that clears the womb. She's been using it successfully for a long time. She has recently heard from another midwife in a neighbouring town that a different preparation might be preferable. She wants your opinion. You listen carefully. The herbs she is describing, the combination she has been using, are well chosen, selected empirically over generations of practice by women who watched what helped and what did not. The alternative preparation she has heard about contains one element that you would recommend against, a herb that is more warming than the situation calls for and that can, if the woman is already running a fever from the delivery, make things worse. You say this directly. She nods. She was already half convinced, she says, but she wanted another opinion. She buys a small quantity of one of the herbs from her preparation, depleted by recent use, pays for it honestly, and leaves. This is a significant transaction, and not just commercially. The midwife's knowledge and your knowledge are two separate streams of the same river. She knows things about the bodies of women in labour and in the weeks after delivery that no text in your shop describes in as much detail. You know things about the properties of preparations and the interaction of ingredients that she may not have had access to learn. When the two streams run together, what results is closer to what people actually need than either stream alone. The official medical hierarchy does not acknowledge this. The trained physician at the top, the apothecary in the middle, and the midwives, wise women, and empirical healers at the bottom, this is how the system represents itself. What actually happens is considerably more complicated, and the healing that takes place in communities depends on all levels of this unofficial hierarchy cooperating even when they do not formally recognise each other's authority. The physician who gave you the prescription this morning would have been surprised to know that the midwife's practical knowledge of postpartum recovery is more detailed and more reliable than anything in the texts he studied. He would not have framed it that way. He would have framed his theoretical training as the foundation and her practice as a collection of folk remedies whose efficacy was incidental and unexplained. He would not have been entirely wrong. He would not have been entirely right. You know this, intuitively if not articulately. You stand between the theoretical world and the practical one, receiving from both sides, translating between them as best you can. It is an uncomfortable position sometimes. It is also, you've come to understand, a necessary one. Someone needs to occupy the space between the theory and the practice, checking whether the theory produces what the practice needs, noting when they diverge, adjusting where possible. The evening light is coming through your single window when the last customer of the day arrives. He is elderly, known to you, a farmer from a few miles outside the town who comes in periodically, with whatever has gone wrong with him or his household, reported in the direct practical terms of someone who does not use medical language because he has never been taught it. His wife, he says, has a swelling on her neck. It has been there for some weeks. It does not pain her much. It is getting larger. You ask questions carefully because swellings of the neck are a category that contains many different things, some requiring nothing more than patience and a poultice, others requiring considerably more concern. You ask about the texture of the swelling, whether it moves when pressed, whether the skin over it is warm or cool, whether she has any other complaints, whether she has lost weight, whether she tires more easily than before. He answers as best he can, translating his wife's experience through his own observations. The picture that assembles itself is not immediately alarming, but is not dismissible either. You recommend that she come in herself, if she's able, and that the physician be consulted before you prepare anything. Some things you can help with independently. This is not one of them. He accepts this with the resignation of someone who expected to be told to see the physician eventually. He asks the price of the physician's visit, and you give him your best estimate, which is approximate because physicians set their own fees, and this particular physician's fees vary with the patient's apparent means. He nods, calculates something behind his eyes, nods again, and thanks you and leaves. You close up the shop in the dimming light, covering the theriac and the other compounds that are sensitive to air and temperature change. You wipe down the counter, you wash the mortar and pestle one more time. The smell of the day's work is in your clothes and your hands and probably in your hair, and it will still be there in the morning when you open again. And this is the smell of a life spent at the intersection of what people know and what people need, which is not always a comfortable intersection but is always a necessary one. Outside, the town is settling into its evening routines. Smoke from fires, the sound of animals being put up for the night, someone calling a name, the ordinary sounds of a community doing what communities do when the working day is over, continuing their lives with the quiet insistence of people who have neither the time nor the inclination to frame what they are doing as history. But it is history. The midwife's knowledge, the farmer's worry, the prescription from the physician, the theriac in its jar, the woman who bought pennyroyal and did not explain why, the old man's willow bark that has been keeping his pain at bay for years without anyone knowing exactly why it works. All of this is history. It is the history that happens in ordinary rooms to ordinary people who are simply trying to stay functional in a world that does not make it easy. You walk home in the evening air as you do every day, in the direction of your own ordinary life, carrying nothing visible but the stain on your fingertips and the accumulation of today's knowledge, which is already reorganizing itself in your mind into the things that worked and the things that did not, the things you knew and the things you're still figuring out. Tomorrow the counter will be there again. The theriac will be in its jar. Someone will arrive with a piece of paper covered in Latin and stand on the other side of the counter and wait for you to do what you know how to do. And you will. It takes a particular kind of confidence to stand behind a counter full of things that smell deeply wrong and tell people with complete authority that this is exactly what they need. You have that confidence. It took years to develop it, years of apprenticeship, years of watching someone older than you hold dried plants up to the light and say this, not that. Years of learning to distinguish between things that look nearly identical and are separated by the difference between relief and a regrettable incident. You have the confidence now, and it sits in your posture and in the way you hold a jar, and you are going to need every bit of it today. Your shop is small. In a prosperous town, an apothecary might occupy a proper building with a dedicated front room for customers and a back room for preparation. In a smaller place, like yours, the counter is 3 steps inside the door, and the preparation area is immediately behind it, separated by a wooden partition with a gap you step through dozens of times a day. The shelves go from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, and they are organized in a system that only you fully understand, which is partly practical and partly intentional. because a shop that only you can navigate is a shop that cannot be easily replaced. The smells hit you before you are fully through the door in the morning, as they always do. The base of it is dried herbs, a deep, complex, slightly sweet and slightly dusty foundation that is the smell of this work and this room and your entire professional life. Lavender sits there, and dried chamomile, and the sharper notes of thyme and sage. But underneath those familiar things are the stranger ones. The sulphurous edge of certain minerals, the heavy sweetness of theriac in its jar, a smell that is almost floral but with something dark beneath it, something animal, because theriac contains, among its many dozens of ingredients, dried viper flesh, and that fact announces itself if you know how to read the room. You also have mummy. This is not a thing that requires extensive introduction. Ground mummified human remains, imported at considerable expense from Egypt and sold as medicine. It is effective, according to the physicians who prescribe it, for the treatment of epilepsy, plague, and a range of other serious conditions. You do not ask questions about the supply chain. You have a small jar on the upper right shelf, clearly labelled, priced accordingly, and moved across the counter perhaps twice a year. It is not your most popular product, but when someone needs it, they need it specifically, and you are the person with the jar. The morning begins with the usual tasks. You check what needs to be ground, what needs to be strained, what has been soaking overnight and is now ready for the next stage of preparation. You have a prescription from the physician that came in yesterday afternoon, a fever case requiring a compound remedy, and you set about preparing it before the shop gets busy. Compound remedies are the core of what separates an apothecary from a herbalist who simply sells dried plants from a market stall. A compound remedy requires knowledge of proportions, of incompatibilities, of the way different ingredients interact and modify each other, of what needs to be ground first and added last, and what must be dissolved before it can be combined with anything else. You have studied this. You have a text, copied from a larger reference work, that guides you on the preparation of the most common compounds. But the text is a starting point. The actual work is judgment, and judgment is what you are selling. The theriac in this prescription is the most complex element. Theriac, in its full traditional form, can contain upwards of 60 ingredients, some rare, some extremely expensive, and it needs to be aged before use, sometimes for years, in order for the components to properly combine. You keep a stock that was prepared some time ago by a previous apothecary in this town, purchased when you took over the business. You also keep a simpler version prepared more recently, which you use for less acute cases. Today you reach for the aged stock, because the physician has asked for it specifically, and because the patient, from the description on the prescription, sounds like someone who needs the real thing. The theriac goes into the bowl first, a measured quantity, weighed on your scale with care, because theriac is expensive enough that waste is not an option. The physician has also prescribed a cooling herb, which in this case is juice of plantain, prepared fresh, which means you need to work the plant through a press and strain the liquid before it can be added to the remedy. This is the part that takes time. The press is a simple wooden device, but it takes effort, and your hands are already stiff from the morning cold. While the plantain liquid drains through the cloth, you begin grinding the astringent element, a dried bark that comes in pieces and needs to be reduced to a fine powder before it will mix properly. The mortar is stone, heavy, and has been in this shop longer than you have. The pestle is smooth from decades of use, worn to a surface that fits your palm exactly. You grind slowly and thoroughly, because a coarse powder will not dissolve correctly, and a poorly dissolved remedy is a remedy that does not work. And a remedy that does not work reflects on you even if the fault is the physician's theory and not your preparation. Someone comes in while you're grinding, a woman, middle-aged, with the expression of someone who has already made their decision and is only here to collect what they decided on. She puts a small piece of paper on the counter and looks at you. You look at the paper. It is not a physician's prescription. It is a description in her own hand of what she wants, written in the vernacular rather than Latin, listing 3 herbs by their common names. This is the other kind of customer, the one who has not seen a physician, cannot afford a physician, and is managing their own or their family's health, using the accumulated knowledge of their community, their mothers and grandmothers, their neighbours, and whatever they have picked up from watching and remembering over the course of a long practical life. These customers are the majority of your actual business. not the formal prescriptions from licensed physicians, but the daily stream of people treating ordinary ailments with ordinary remedies that everyone in the community knows. You look at what she has written: pennyroyal, ginger, rue. You look at her again, not long, just a moment. This combination is used for several things: digestive complaints, the stimulation of delayed menstruation, the termination of early pregnancy. You know this, she knows you know this. Neither of you says any of it directly. You weigh each herb separately, wrap them carefully in small parcels of cloth, and tell her the price. She pays without comment, takes the parcels, and leaves. You return to the plantain press, squeezing the last of the liquid through the cloth, and do not think about this too much more. You're not the physician, you're not the confessor, you are the person who knows what things do and sells them to people who need them, and the moral landscape of that role is something you have learned to navigate by looking straight ahead. The midday hours bring a cluster of people, a child with a cough, sent by parents who have tried the home remedies and found them insufficient. You sell them a preparation of horehound and honey, which is soothing, genuinely, and which the child will take without too much resistance because it is sweet. An old man with joint pain who comes every 2 weeks for the same preparation of willow bark, which he has been taking long enough that he calls it by the name he has given it himself rather than its proper name, and which does in fact reduce his pain, because willow bark contains a compound that the 19th century would eventually isolate and call salicin, which is closely related to what the 20th century would call aspirin. He does not know this. You do not know this. What you both know is that it works. A young man who looks embarrassed. He wants something for a condition he describes in circuitous terms, using several words in place of the direct one. The condition is a venereal one. You sell him a preparation that is unlikely to address the underlying infection in any meaningful way, but that may ease some of the symptoms, and that is, at minimum, not going to poison him, which is better than what some of his neighbours might have recommended. There is a woman who wants something to help her husband sleep. She describes him as unable to quiet his mind at night, lying awake for hours, exhausted and irritable during the day. You give her valerian root, prepared as a decoction, with instructions for how to brew it. Valerian has been used as a sleep aid since ancient times and continues to be sold for this purpose in the modern world, though researchers have found its mechanisms more complex and its reliability more variable than its long reputation suggests. There is a man who has been sent by his employer, a merchant, who requires a preparation for energy and alertness before a long trading journey. You consider what you have. There is a preparation of betony that is commonly recommended for this purpose. There is also something more potent, a preparation involving small amounts of theriac and a warming spice combination that you use carefully, because warming the system too aggressively can cause its own problems. You split the difference and give him something moderate, with instructions to take it in the morning and not to take it twice in a day. Late in the afternoon, a physician comes in himself, not the one whose prescription you were filling in the morning. Another one, younger, trained more recently, with the slightly impatient manner of someone who has recently completed a university education and has not yet had enough practice to sand the edges off his confidence. He wants to examine your stock of a particular plant compound, checking, he says, that your preparation matches the standard described in the text he cites, which is a recent translation of an Arab medical author whose name he uses in a way that suggests it is important to him that you know he is familiar with this text. You show him the preparation, you show him how it was made, you show him the proportions. He examines it carefully, makes several comments about consistency, and then admits that it looks correct. He buys a quantity. He leaves slightly less brusquely than he arrived, which is probably as close to approval as you're going to get. After he's gone, you stand behind the counter for a moment in the quiet of the late afternoon and consider what just happened. The physician spent 4 or more years at university learning to diagnose and prescribe within a theoretical framework. You spent years in apprenticeship learning to prepare and dispense what the framework requires. In theory, the hierarchy is clear. The physician is at the top, trained in the Latin tradition, licensed by the university system, carrying the authority of ancient Greece and medieval scholarship. You are below him, skilled but subordinate, the craftsman to his theorist. In practice, the line is considerably blurrier. Physicians diagnose and prescribe, but they depend entirely on your knowledge and your preparations to execute what they have ordered. A prescription written by a physician is only as good as the apothecary who fills it. if you substitute an inferior ingredient, if you measure imprecisely, if you do not know that two components of a compound remedy interact poorly and counteract each other, the physician's elegant theory produces nothing, or worse. There are apothecaries who cut their preparations with cheaper materials. This is a known problem and the subject of periodic regulatory concern by both municipal authorities and medical guilds. There are apothecaries who sell things they know to be ineffective to customers who do not know better. There are apothecaries who take advantage of the desperation of the sick to charge prices that are by any measure unreasonable. You try not to be any of these apothecaries, but you are also aware that the system does not make it easy to check, and that the consequences for the customer of a bad apothecary are often invisible, absorbed into the ordinary mortality of a world where many people die of things that could not have been treated no matter how honest the preparation. The light through the window has turned the amber. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You begin the closing routines. The cover goes over the theriac. The ground materials from the morning go into their labelled containers. The mortar gets rinsed and wiped. The prescription you prepared goes into a labelled parcel, ready for collection tomorrow if the messenger comes. You check the shelves, mentally cataloguing what needs to be restocked, what needs to be reordered, what has run lower than expected because a particular ailment has been more common this season than last. Summer brings its own patterns. Heat produces conditions that winter does not. Autumn will bring others. The work adjusts itself to the seasons, and the seasons turn regardless of whether the apothecary is ready. You close the shutters. The smells of the shop settle around you as they always do at the end of the day. The herbs and the minerals and the strange, flat undertone of things that have been dried and ground and stored for purposes that no one entirely understands. It is a complicated smell. It is also, after all this time, simply the smell of your days, the smell of work that is partially knowledge, partially skill, partially judgment, and partially faith that the connection between what you know how to do and what the sick body requires is close enough to matter. You lock the door. The town moves past outside, indifferent to the contents of the shelves. Someone out there has a fever that the physician is treating with your preparation. Someone else is taking the pennyroyal home for whatever use she intends. The old man's joints are perhaps a little easier tonight because of the willow bark. You walk home in the evening air carrying the weight of the day in your hands, which are stained at the fingertips in a colour that no amount of washing ever fully removes, the permanent signature of a trade that has existed as long as people have been sick, and as long as there have been others willing to learn what grows in the ground and what it might possibly do. There is one more piece of the apothecary's world that does not fit neatly into any of the other categories, but that belongs in the picture anyway, because it describes the daily texture of the work more accurately than the dramatic cases do. The remedies for things that are not serious, the preparations that occupy the majority of the shelf space and the majority of the transactions, and that never appear in the formal medical texts because they are too ordinary to require documentation. A preparation for cracked lips, made with beeswax and a small quantity of rendered fat and a touch of honey, which costs almost nothing to make and which does exactly what it claims to do. A wash for irritated eyes, made with chamomile steeped and cooled and strained through cloth until it is perfectly clear, which soothes because chamomile contains compounds that reduce inflammation, even though the explanation offered for its effectiveness has nothing to do with inflammation and everything to do with the cooling and moist properties of the preparation correcting a heat excess in the affected tissue. A preparation for toothache, which is perhaps the most reliable source of income in any apothecary's practice, because toothache is universal, and because the primary remedy for toothache, clove oil, works reliably enough that patients return for it by name. Clove oil contains eugenol, which is still used as a dental analgesic in the 21st century. The medieval apothecary did not know why it worked. He knew that it worked because customers came back, and customers who have found something that works for toothache do not switch to something else. A preparation for the relief of headache, which might be a cold cloth pressed to the forehead, or powdered willow bark dissolved in water, or a more complex compound depending on the physician's assessment of the cause. Headaches were understood in humoral terms as products of excess heat or cold in the head, and the treatments were calibrated accordingly. The willow bark worked regardless of the reasoning. The cold cloth also worked, though again for reasons that the humoral framework did not correctly describe. These ordinary remedies for ordinary complaints in ordinary people going about their ordinary lives were the actual substance of the apothecary's work most days. Not the theriac, not the mummy in its small labelled jar, not the complex prescriptions from physicians treating serious fevers, just the cracked lips and the headaches and the toothaches and the sore eyes and the stiff joints and the mild indigestion that make up the daily texture of being a body in the world, which has not changed much across the centuries even as everything that was understood about it has changed almost completely. The story that gets told about medieval medicine is a simple one. It goes like this. After the fall of Rome, Europe forgot everything it once knew. The great advances of Greek and Roman medicine were lost, buried, or burned. What replaced them was superstition. People prayed over wounds and attached leeches to things for reasons no one could fully explain. Physicians consulted astrology charts while patients died. The church opposed dissection and blocked scientific progress. It was 1,000 years of darkness between ancient achievement and the eventual renaissance of real knowledge in the modern era. This story is satisfying. It is also mostly wrong. The reality of medieval medicine is considerably stranger and more interesting than the simple darkness narrative suggests. It was wrong in important ways, certainly. It was limited in ways that caused real suffering. It failed people in moments that a later age would have saved them. But it was not superstition dressed up as science. It was a complete, functional intellectual system, internally coherent and genuinely sophisticated in places, operating with the best information available to it and constrained by limitations that were structural rather than moral. Understanding what medieval medicine actually was requires starting with the framework that everything else rested on. Humoral theory, as developed by Hippocrates and his followers in ancient Greece and elaborated by Galen in the 2nd century, was not a crude system. It was an attempt to explain human physiology in terms of observable patterns, the way illness tends to present differently in different seasons, the way certain foods seem to worsen certain conditions, the way the same treatment works on some patients and fails on others. The patterns were real, the explanations were wrong, but the patterns were real. Galen in particular was the dominant medical authority of the medieval period, not just in Europe but in the Arab world, where his works were translated, commented on, and extended by physicians like Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, whose canon of medicine became a standard text in European medical schools for centuries. The relationship between European and Arab medicine in the medieval period is one of the things most thoroughly erased by the darkness narrative. Arab physicians did not simply preserve Greek knowledge while Europe slept. They extended it, criticized it, experimented with it, and produced original work of their own. And much of what entered European medicine in the 11th and 12th centuries through translation centres in Spain and Sicily was Arab medicine, refined and developed over several centuries, feeding back into a European system that had never fully lost contact with its classical roots but had certainly let some threads go slack. The medical schools of Salerno in southern Italy were producing trained physicians by the 11th century, drawing on a mix of Latin, Greek and Arab sources in a tradition that was cosmopolitan, in a way that the simple darkness narrative makes impossible to account for. By the 12th and 13th centuries, university medical faculties at Bologna, Montpellier, Paris and Oxford were teaching systematic text-based medicine to students who would practice across Europe. The curriculum was demanding, the Latin was difficult, the texts were ancient and had been through multiple translations. But the goal was genuine knowledge, carefully taught and carefully applied. The question of what medieval physicians actually knew is complicated by the fact that what knowing something meant in this context was different from what it means in a modern scientific framework. Medieval medical knowledge was authoritative and textual. A physician knew what Galen said. A physician knew what Avicenna said. A physician knew how to apply the theory of the 4 humours to the presentation of a specific patient. Whether any of this corresponded to the underlying biological reality was not a question the framework was designed to ask, because the framework already had its answer. The answer was in the texts. This is the first and most important crack in the official image. Medieval medicine presented itself as knowledge. What it was, in significant part, was scholarship. And scholarship and knowledge are not the same thing when the scholarship is of ancient texts, whose relationship to biological reality was never experimentally verified. dissection is a useful place to sit with this tension. The Church's opposition to dissection is one of the great myths of the darkness narrative, endlessly repeated, largely inaccurate. Human dissection was practiced at Italian medical schools from the 13th century onward. Andreas Vesalius, who published his great anatomical work in 1543 and is often credited with founding modern anatomy, was not operating in a world that had never seen a human body opened for study. He was operating in a world that had seen plenty of bodies opened, but had mostly been looking at them through the lens of Galen's descriptions, seeing what they expected to see rather than what was there. This is the subtler failure of medieval medicine, and it is more interesting than the simple darkness story. The failure was not that physicians did not look at bodies. The failure was that when they looked for Galen. When the actual anatomy differed from Galen's description, which it did, often, the tendency was to decide that the body was wrong rather than the text. This is a genuine cognitive problem, and it belongs specifically to a knowledge system that treats textual authority as primary. You can have dissection and still not have progress, if what you take from the dissection is confirmation of what you already believed rather than correction of what you got wrong. The situation was not uniform. There were medieval physicians who noticed discrepancies and noted them carefully, who added qualifications to the received wisdom, who recorded observations that did not fit the existing framework. The literature is full of moments where the text and the observation were clearly in tension, and someone tried to hold both. But the system did not have a mechanism for resolving that tension in favour of the observation. The authority was always upstream of the evidence, and without a framework that could systematically privilege evidence over authority, incremental observation could not accumulate into systemic correction. What medieval medicine was genuinely good at is worth naming honestly. Wound care had a practical tradition that predated and ran alongside the theoretical one. Surgeons, who were generally considered lower in status than physicians, and who worked with their hands in ways that the learned physician did not, accumulated real practical knowledge about how wounds heal, what promotes healing, and what causes the death of tissue. Hildegard of Bingen's contemporary Roger of Salerno wrote a surgical text that described techniques for wound management, skull fractures, and hernia repair that were not merely theoretical. They were the record of things that had been tried and had worked, or had been tried and had failed, and the difference had been noted. The management of broken bones was another area of genuine competence. Setting and splinting fractures is not theoretically complex, and it produces observable results. Medieval practitioners knew how to do it. They were not always doing it correctly by later standards, but they were doing something real that sometimes produced functional outcomes, and the knowledge accumulated through repetition, in a way that purely textual learning could not replicate. Herbal medicine, the most ordinary and widespread form of medical care in the medieval world, is the hardest to evaluate because the gap between official theory and actual practice was so large. Officially, herbs worked because of their humoral properties, their relative warmth, coldness, moisture, or dryness, which could be used to correct imbalances in the patient. The theory determined which herb was appropriate for which condition. But many of the herbs that medieval practitioners recommended actually contain compounds that have measurable biological effects, and they used them in ways that, regardless of the theoretical justification, produced real results. Willow bark for pain, foxglove, carefully used for heart conditions, opium for pain, relief and sleep, alcohol in various forms as an antiseptic and sedative, honey as a wound covering that does in fact have antimicrobial properties due to its low water content and hydrogen peroxide production. The plants that experienced practitioners reached for were not randomly selected. They were selected by the accumulated trial and error of generations, and the theoretical framework that was later built on top of them was a post hoc explanation for observed effects, not the source of those effects. This matters because it means that the most effective parts of medieval medicine were operating at two levels simultaneously. At the official level, the level of the trained physician, and the university curriculum, everything was theory, texts, and humoral framework. At the level of actual practice, especially among those who worked directly and repeatedly with the sick, there was a parallel accumulation of real knowledge that the theoretical system could not fully account for and did not always acknowledge. The gap between these two levels produced what might charitably be called creative documentation. When a physician recommended a remedy that worked, and then wrote down why it worked in terms of humoral theory, he was often providing an explanation that was disconnected from the actual mechanism. The remedy worked. The explanation was wrong. But the record captured only the explanation, not the mechanism, which means that what passed down through the written tradition was a set of recommendations with incorrect justifications attached. And the incorrect justifications sometimes led to incorrect modifications of the recommendations by later practitioners who took the theory more seriously than the observation. The magical elements of medieval medicine are the part that the modern imagination tends to fixate on, and they deserve fair treatment. Charms, prayers, specific words spoken over wounds, the use of amulets, the appeal to specific saints associated with specific illnesses, the application of relics. All of these were practiced by real physicians in the medieval period alongside the humoral treatments, and they were not understood as belonging to a different category. The boundary between natural medicine and supernatural intervention was not clearly drawn in the medieval mind, because the medieval worldview did not contain the concept of a natural world operating by purely mechanical laws, with the supernatural occupying a separate and non-overlapping domain. God was continuously present in the operation of nature. The properties of herbs were God's properties, planted in them for human use. A prayer over a wound was not replacing medicine, it was completing it. This is genuinely different from how a modern person relates to medicine, and it is important not to simply translate it as ignorance. The framework was wrong in ways that mattered for outcomes, but it was not without its own internal logic, and some of its practical effects were not nothing. The placebo effect, which modern medicine treats as a nuisance to be controlled for, is a real biological phenomenon with measurable physiological effects. The ritual of medical treatment, the attention of a practitioner, the sense that something is being done with intention and authority, produces real changes in pain perception, in immune function, in the likelihood of recovery. Medieval medicine was exceptionally good at producing the ritual. Whether what surrounded the ritual was accurate was, for the patient's immediate experience, not always the most important variable. The plague is where the failure of medieval medicine becomes most visible and most catastrophic. The Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of the population in 4 years, making it one of the most lethal events in human history. Medieval medicine had nothing for it. The humoral framework was unable to account for the speed of its spread, the pattern of its mortality, or the mechanism of its transmission. Physicians proposed explanations, corrupt air, astrological conjunctions, imbalances in the atmosphere produced by earthquakes, and none of them were correct. Treatments were attempted, bloodletting, dietary changes, aromatic herbs burned to purify the air, and none of them worked. The failure was not from lack of effort or lack of intelligence, it was structural. A system that explains disease as humoral imbalance in individual bodies has no framework for understanding a pathogen that spreads through contact and kills faster than the humoral system can respond to. The germ theory of disease, which would eventually provide a framework that could actually account for plague transmission and eventually produce treatments, was not just a different conclusion within the same framework. It was a different framework entirely, requiring a different set of assumptions about what disease is and where it comes from. What the plague period revealed, painfully and at enormous cost, was that the official image of medieval medicine as a complete and sufficient system for understanding human illness was not accurate. The practitioners were sincere, the system was coherent, the training was real, and when the worst thing happened, it was not enough, and the gap between what the system claimed to know and what it actually knew became visible in a way that could not be argued away. The recovery from the Black Death took generations. The eventual changes in medical thinking that contributed to what historians call the scientific revolution were not inevitable consequences of the plague, but the catastrophic demonstration of a system's limits does tend to create space for alternative approaches, and the 15th and 16th centuries saw increasing willingness to privilege observation over authority in ways that the medieval university system had resisted. But here is the thing that gets lost in the before and after telling of this story. The people practicing medicine in the medieval period were not foolish, lazy, or indifferent to the suffering of the sick. They were working with what they had, within a framework that was the best available synthesis of ancient knowledge, Arab scholarship, and practical observation that their world had produced. Many of them cared deeply about their patients. Many of them noticed things that did not fit the theory and recorded them carefully, contributing to a gradual accumulation of anomalies that would eventually force the theory to change. Many of them helped real people, not because the theory was correct, but because the practice embedded within the theory contained enough real knowledge to make a genuine difference. The official image of medieval medicine was a complete system, ancient in its authority, comprehensive in its scope, sufficient for any illness a physician might encounter. The reality behind that image was a system stretched between ancient texts and immediate observation, holding both as best it could, producing genuine care and genuine failure in proportions that shifted, depending on the illness, the practitioner, and the very particular luck of being sick at a moment when the available remedies happened to match what the body actually needed. That gap between the image and the reality is not a story of deception. It is a story about the natural limits of what any intellectual system can know before the tools to know more have been invented. And there is something quietly recognizable in it. Every age has its official medical image and its hidden gaps. Every era treats some things with complete confidence that later generations will look at with the same mixture of appreciation and dismay that we now direct at the urine flask and the bloodletting bowl. The question is not whether any given system contains the whole truth. It is whether the people inside it are doing what they can with what they have, and whether what they have is enough. For medieval medicine, the answer is complicated and the stakes were high, and the record is both more impressive and more limited than the simple story allows, which is in the end the honest answer for most of human history. More than the myth, less than the ideal, genuinely trying, genuinely failing in places, and leaving enough behind that we are still arguing about what exactly was right, what was wrong, and what, against all reasonable expectation, might have actually worked. And so we find ourselves at the end of tonight's journey, somewhere between the physician's urine flask and the apothecary's stained fingertips, having travelled through a world that approached the mystery of human suffering with every tool it possessed, which were, by turns, remarkable and wrong, specific and speculative, borrowed and original, and always, in every case, the product of minds doing what minds have always done when confronted with pain they cannot fully explain and life they cannot fully preserve. The patient lying in the sickroom with a fever, feeling the weight of the physician's attention as a kind of care even when the care could not cure, understood something that the darkness narrative misses entirely. Being seen matters. Being attended to by someone with a framework, even a flawed one, even a wrong one, matters. The ritual of treatment, the laying on of attention, the translation of suffering into a category that could be named and addressed. These things did something real even when the medicine did not. Hildegard of Bingen knew this. She wrote music that she believed could restore the harmony of a disordered body, and what she was describing, in the language available to her, is something that researchers in the modern world are still trying to measure and explain and find proper words for. The intuition preceded the language by 800 years. That is not failure. That is the normal speed of human understanding, which moves in the wrong direction as often as the right one, and still manages eventually to accumulate something worth passing on. The apothecary behind the counter knew it too in a more practical way. The woman who came in for the pennyroyal did not need a physician's explanation. She needed someone who knew what things did, and who would give them to her without making her justify the need. That knowledge, local and practical and largely invisible in the official record, was doing quiet work throughout the medieval world, in every community where someone knew which plant grew by which stream, and what to do with it when someone you loved was suffering. And the system itself, for all its limits, preserved something worth preserving. The discipline of attending, the practice of building a framework that connects symptoms to causes and causes to treatments, the insistence that suffering is not random, that it has a shape, and that the shape can be learned, and that learning it is a moral obligation as well as an intellectual one. Modern medicine inherited that insistence from the medieval physicians it likes to dismiss, even as it corrected almost everything those physicians believed. It is late now. The herbs on the apothecary's shelf are quiet in the dark. The physician's bag is closed and settled in the corner. Hildegard's music, if someone were playing it, would fill this moment perfectly. those soaring intervals that sound less like the 12th century than like something that has always existed, and was simply being reported from a location most people could not reach. The patient in the sick room is breathing more steadily. Whether it is the barley water or the bloodletting or simply time and luck, it is impossible to say. The body does its own work, mostly without our knowledge, mostly beyond our intervention, occasionally in spite of it. It did this in the 12th century and it does it now. We circle it with our frameworks and our instruments and our best available understanding, and it continues its quiet enterprise regardless. Close your eyes. Let the strangeness of all this settle into something softer. The world is very old, and people have been trying very hard for a very long time, and that effort, however imperfect, is its own kind of comfort if you let it be. Rest now. The history will still be here in the morning, strange and human and full of things no one expected. The recovery. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The recovery, when it comes quietly. This is the thing about illness that the drama of the medical consultation obscures. The fact that most of the actual work of getting better happens in the unglamorous intervals, the long hours of lying still while your body does what bodies are built to do. The fever breaks on the third night. You wake at some hour before dawn aware of something different, a quality of the air on your skin that is cooler than it has been, a sense that the pressure behind your eyes has eased slightly. You lie still for several minutes, not trusting it, waiting for the familiar heaviness to reassert itself. It does not. The barley water has been sitting at your bedside and you drink some of it, more carefully than you need to now, still operating in the rationing mode of the sick, even though the crisis has passed. It tastes different. Things taste different when the fever goes. The slight bitterness of the grain comes through again, which is odd given that you were aware of nothing but the sweetness of the honey when you were at your worst. It is as if the fever had taken over one part of your perception, and now, receding, is returning things to their usual proportions. You sleep again, properly this time, not the fractured, suspended sleep of the past 3 nights, but something with actual depth to it. The kind of sleep that leaves a mark on your body in the form of stiffness and weight when you wake from it. When you do wake, the room is full of morning light and you're hungry. Not the cautious, theoretical hunger of illness, the kind that suggested eating without actually wanting it. This is real hunger. The body reclaiming its ordinary demands, filing a clear request after several days of making do with minimal input. You eat the soup that someone brings with a thoroughness that surprises even you, and then you ask if there is more. This is recovery, not dramatic, not marked by any particular moment, just the slow return of appetite and the clearing of the head, and the discovery that the ceiling beam you have been staring at for 3 days is actually quite uninteresting when you no longer have to stare at it. You are going to be fine. You knew this in some baseline way throughout, but knowing it abstractly and feeling it as physical fact are different things, and the second one is considerably better. The physician has left instructions to be sent for if the fever returned or if certain signs appeared. None of them appeared. You follow the diet for another week, out of caution rather than strict necessity, because the physician's confidence about diet was such that abandoning it prematurely feels like tempting something. The theriac from the apothecary is taken as prescribed, tasting of something complex and faintly medicinal that you cannot quite name. Whether it helped or not is a question you cannot answer, because you do not know what your recovery would have looked like without it. It is possible it helped. It is possible it was irrelevant. The body's healing is not an experiment with controls. It is a fact that arrives or fails to arrive and resist clean analysis. You are left, at the end of it, with a specific kind of knowledge. The knowledge of having been sick and having been treated and having recovered, with enough distance now to look back at the consultation and see it clearly. The physician was confident and thorough and believed completely in what he was doing. The framework he was operating within was wrong in important ways. The treatment he prescribed was partially irrelevant, and in the case of the bloodletting, probably counterproductive. And you're sitting up eating soup in the morning light, which means something went right, even if the attribution is complicated. What went right, you will never fully know. Whether it was the rest, the diet, the theriac, the time, the body's own fighting, some combination of all of these in proportions you cannot identify. The answer is not available to you, and would not have been available to the physician if you had asked. He would have given you the humoral framework. He would have said the blood removal allowed the heat to dissipate, that the theriac supported the liver in its work, that the cooling diet prevented the excess bile from building further. He would have believed every word of it. And you are here, recovered, without the means to confirm or refute any of it. This is the epistemological condition of the patient in any era. Receiving treatment within a framework you cannot fully evaluate, trusting that the framework is the best available even when you cannot verify this directly, watching your body respond or fail to respond, and accepting that the causal chain connecting treatment to outcome is longer and more complicated than any of the practitioners involved are positioned to trace. The barley water, in the end, is what you remember most clearly. Warm, slightly sweet, always available. Someone kept bringing it. That someone understood, without needing a theory, that the sick need to be offered things constantly, even when they cannot drink much at a time. That the presence of the cup matters even when the cup goes untouched for hours. That care is not only what the physician prescribes, it is also what happens in the intervals between prescriptions. The surgeons occupied a peculiar and uncomfortable position in the landscape of medieval medicine, and it is worth understanding this position carefully before moving further into what medieval medical practice actually looked like from the inside. A trained physician, meaning a man who had attended a university and studied Galen and Avicenna and Hippocrates through years of textual study, would have regarded surgery with a mixture of respect and condescension that mirrors a very modern kind of professional hierarchy. Physicians worked with the mind. They diagnosed, they prescribed, they operated through theory and through the recommendation of treatment. Surgeons worked with their hands. They cut and sutured and cauterized and reset and drained. The hands were lower than the mind in the hierarchy of medieval intellectual culture, and this meant that surgeons, however skilled, occupied a lower rung. In England, surgeons were associated with barbers, and the barber surgeon was a real figure in the medieval world, someone who cut hair and performed minor surgical procedures at the same counter. This sounds like a joke, but it was straightforwardly practical. Barbers already had razors. Razors were useful for surgical incisions. The skills required for a close shave were related to the skills required for certain other kinds of precise cutting. The association persisted for centuries. What surgeons actually knew, however, was in many ways more grounded in observable reality than what the university-trained physician knew, because surgery produces immediate feedback. You set a bone, and you can see whether it sets correctly. You drain an abscess, and you can see whether the drainage is complete. You close a wound with stitches, and you can observe whether the wound heals cleanly or becomes corrupted. The feedback loop is tight, and tight feedback loops, applied over generations of practice, produce real knowledge even in the absence of a correct theoretical framework. The great surgical texts of the medieval period, Roger of Salerno's Chirurgia from the 12th century, the work of Theodoric of Lucca from the 13th, the writings of Guy de Chauliac from the 14th, these documents contain genuine surgical knowledge. The descriptions of wound management, of techniques for dealing with embedded arrows and broken bones, of approaches to hernias and cataracts, and the treatment of fistulas are not purely theoretical. They are the record of procedures that were performed on real bodies, with real outcomes and real consequences for the people performing them. Theodoric of Lucca's work is particularly interesting in retrospect because he advocated for a wound management approach that was significantly better than the standard of his time, and he was mostly ignored for it. The dominant view, following Galen, was that wounds needed to produce laudable pus, that the suppuration of a wound was a sign that it was healing properly, that the pus represented the body expelling the corrupt matter and purifying the wound. This view was wrong. Pus is the product of infection, not of healing. A wound that suppurates is a wound that is being colonized by bacteria, not a wound that is progressing normally. Theodoric, based apparently on observation rather than textual authority, argued that wounds healed better when kept clean and dry, that the suppuration that his contemporaries celebrated as healthy was actually harmful, and that wounds treated without the insertion of materials intended to promote pus formation healed faster and more completely. He was right. He was also describing, without understanding the mechanism, the basic principle that would eventually underlie antiseptic wound management. He was not widely followed. The authority of Galen on the laudability of pews was too well established. and Theodoric's empirical observation, lacking the theoretical support that the humoral framework provided for the suppuration model, could not gain traction against the received wisdom. This is the structural problem again. Evidence without a framework that can assimilate it simply does not accumulate in the way it needs to in order to change practice. Theodoric saw something real and reported it accurately, and it made almost no difference for the next several centuries. The management of battlefield wounds is perhaps the clearest area where medieval surgical knowledge was doing real work in real conditions with observable results. Military surgery developed through painful experience during the Crusades, during the constant internecine conflicts of European kingdoms, during the siege warfare that destroyed both armies and populations, with the democratic efficiency of flying masonry and burning oil. Surgeons who worked on campaign were doing emergency medicine, and emergency medicine requires fast, practical judgment, the kind that textbooks can only partly prepare you for. The extraction of arrows was a specific and significant challenge. Arrowheads of the period were of different types, broadheads and bodkin points and hunting heads, and they behaved differently in flesh and in bone. A broadhead that has passed through soft tissue can sometimes be pushed through rather than pulled back, because pulling back drags the barbs through undamaged tissue and makes everything worse. A bodkin that has struck bone requires a different approach than one that has passed cleanly through muscle. Surgeons who survived long enough to accumulate experience developed genuine expertise in these distinctions, expertise that was transmitted through apprenticeship and demonstration rather than through texts. Trepanation, the drilling or cutting of a hole in the skull, was performed in the medieval period for several purposes, including the relief of pressure following head injuries, the treatment of certain headaches, and what the surgeons of the time described as the removal of corrupt matter from the brain. The evidence for survival of this procedure in the medieval period is better than you might expect. Archaeological examination of skulls from medieval sites occasionally reveals trepanation holes with evidence of bone regrowth at the edges, which means the patient survived long enough after the procedure for healing to begin. Not all of them, but some. And the fact that any survived at all given the conditions is a testament to something, either the surgical skill involved, the resilience of the patients, or the specific mercy of the universe on occasions. Pain management in medieval surgery is the part that is hardest to contemplate now. The anaesthetic options available to a medieval surgeon were limited to soporific preparations, combinations of substances including opium, mandrake, hemlock, and other sedating plants, administered in drinks that could render a patient unconscious, or at least semi-conscious, for a procedure. These work to varying degrees. Opium in sufficient quantity is genuinely effective as a sedative and analgesic. Mandrake is mildly sedating, and has been attributed stronger powers than it actually possesses. The combination drinks were imprecise in their dosing, and in their effects, producing a range of outcomes from mild sedation to unconsciousness to occasionally death. Many procedures were performed without effective anaesthesia. Speed was therefore a virtue in a medieval surgeon in a way that modern surgery, with reliable anaesthesia, does not require. A surgeon who could amputate a limb quickly was sparing the patient significant suffering. A surgeon who was thorough but slow was, whatever his other qualities, causing more pain. The descriptions of the fastest medieval surgeons note their speed as a mark of excellence, in a way that a modern surgical description would not, because for modern surgery speed is not the primary consideration in the same way. The patients, for their part, were restrained by assistants. This was routine and expected. A patient who moved during a procedure could be killed by the movement, and preventing movement was therefore both merciful and practical. The assistants who held patients down during medieval surgeries were performing a form of anaesthesia that was imprecise and exhausting, and required a specific kind of practical courage, the courage of someone who can watch suffering up close while doing something that contributes to a good outcome. What medieval medicine did well for mental illness is a more complicated question than it first appears, because the category of mental illness did not exist as such in the medieval period. Conditions that a modern clinician would recognise as depression, as mania, as psychosis, as anxiety disorders, were understood within frameworks that mixed the physiological, the spiritual and the demonic in ways that make clean evaluation very difficult. A person exhibiting what we would now call psychotic symptoms might be understood as possessed, as spiritually assailed, as experiencing an excess of black bile producing melancholia, or as genuinely receiving messages from a divine source. All of these were lived possibilities in the medieval framework, and which one was applied in a specific case depended on the community, the person, their social position, and the observers involved. The monasteries were significant sites of care for those experiencing mental or psychological distress, partly because they offered community and structure, and partly because the monastic tradition included specific practices of spiritual direction that functioned as something like therapeutic conversation. The spiritual director who met regularly with a monk or nun in distress was not a therapist in any modern sense, but the practice of attending carefully to another person's inner life, of listening without judgment, of asking questions that helped the sufferer articulate what they were experiencing. These were real practices with real effects on the people who received them. Hildegard of Bingen was not unusual among medieval abbesses in taking the psychological dimensions of her community's health seriously. She wrote about states of spiritual dryness, the feeling of disconnection from God and from one's own life that she called the state of the wandering mind, with a specificity that suggests personal familiarity as well as pastoral observation. Her remedies for these states were practical: rest, moderate work, maintaining the daily rhythms of liturgical life, human contact and conversation, and the music that she believed worked directly on the life force of the soul. She did not wait for suffering to become acute before addressing it. She was watching for it. The hospitals of the medieval period are worth considering separately from the physician and the apothecary, because they represented a different kind of medical institution, one whose goals were simultaneously more modest and more ambitious than those of private medicine. The hospital was not primarily a place where people went to be cured. The cure rate in medieval hospitals was not reliably higher than the cure rate outside them. The hospital was primarily a place where people went to be cared for, to be fed, to be sheltered from the cold, to die with some religious rites available. The care was sincere, often genuinely compassionate, and largely independent of the theoretical medical framework that trained physicians operated within. The nursing orders of the medieval period, communities of women and men who staffed these hospitals, developed their own practical knowledge of wound care, of the management of fever, of the feeding of the seriously ill, of the signs that indicated imminent death, and the rituals appropriate to accompany it. This knowledge was not written down in the medical texts. It was transmitted through demonstration and practice within communities of care, and it represented a genuine and overlooked form of medical knowledge that existed in parallel to the official theoretical tradition. The hospitals attached to great religious houses were often the best equipped, with access to herb gardens that supplied medicinal plants, with the resources to provide adequate food and bedding, and with the organisational stability that allowed for consistent care over long periods. Smaller hospitals, often founded by pious donors and operating on more limited resources, varied greatly in what they could offer, but the intention across all of them was consistent: to provide for those who had no other provision, who were sick and poor and without family to care for them, and who would otherwise have had nothing. In this sense, the medieval hospital is doing something that is recognisably the ancestor of modern public health infrastructure. The theory behind it, the understanding of why illness happens and what to do about it, is wrong. The institutional commitment, the insistence that the sick poor deserve organised care, is right, and it persists through all the theoretical changes that medicine will eventually undergo, because institutions outlive the theories that justified them, especially when the institutions are doing something that people recognise as necessary, regardless of the framework. There is a particular kind of remedy that appears throughout the medieval medical literature and that deserves attention before we leave the apothecary's counter and move into the broader analysis of the system, because it illustrates in miniature the problem of reading medieval medicine from a modern perspective. The remedy in question is theriac, the compound preparation that was considered the most important and most comprehensive medicine of the ancient and medieval world, the one mentioned in the physician's prescription, the one in the large jar on the upper right shelf. Theriac requires a separate accounting. It originated as an antidote to poison, specifically to snakebite. The name comes from the Greek word for wild beast, and the preparation was associated from early in its history with Mithridates VI of Pontus, the 1st-century king who was said to have systematically ingested small amounts of various poisons in order to build immunity, and who eventually developed a complex antidote preparation that became legendary in the ancient world. The preparation that reached the medieval period under the name theriac bore only a partial relationship to any specific ancient recipe, because it had been elaborated, modified, and complicated through centuries of use and commentary until it contained, in its full traditional form, anywhere from 40 to more than 80 distinct ingredients. Among these ingredients were opium, which is genuinely sedating and analgesic, and would have had real effects on anyone taking the preparation, several plants with antimicrobial properties, honey, which as already noted has measurable effects on wound healing and is not simply symbolic, various warming spices whose effects on digestion are real though modest, and dried viper flesh, which was included on the theory that the poison of the snake, properly prepared and reduced, becomes the antidote to itself, a principle of sympathetic medicine that resonates oddly with the later development of immunization, though the mechanism is entirely different. Theriac was, in practice, an extremely expensive placebo spiked with a significant dose of opium, surrounded by a supporting cast of ingredients with varying and often genuine minor effects. The opium component explains much of its reputation. A medicine that reliably reduces pain and anxiety will be perceived as effective for almost any condition, because pain and anxiety are components of almost every serious illness, and reducing them produces measurable improvement in the patient's subjective experience. That this improvement does not address the underlying condition is a problem that presents itself only later, when the theriac wears off and the condition reasserts itself. Or not, if the condition was self-limiting and had run its course by then. The physicians who prescribed theriac believed they were using the most powerful general medicine available to them, the preparation that addressed the deepest humoral imbalances and protected against the widest range of dangers. They were wrong about the mechanism. They were not entirely wrong about the effect, because the opium in it was doing real work. The gap between what they believed they were doing and what they were actually doing is the kind of gap that appears throughout medieval medicine if you look closely, not deception, not ignorance exactly, but a systematic mismatch between the explanation and the mechanism. The Arab physicians, who are so central to the transmission and development of medical knowledge in the medieval period, are frequently reduced, in simplified histories, to preservers rather than innovators. This is an enormous distortion. Al-Razi, known in the Latin West as Razors, working in Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries, produced a medical encyclopedia of vast scope that included careful clinical descriptions of diseases distinguished by their specific symptom patterns, an approach that was genuinely empirical rather than primarily theoretical. His distinction between smallpox and measles as separate diseases, made on the basis of observable differences in how each presented, is a genuine contribution to diagnostic medicine that preceded anything comparable in the European tradition by centuries. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, working a century later, produced the Canon of Medicine, which became one of the most influential medical textbooks in history, used in European universities until the 17th century. The Canon is not simply a reorganization of Galenic material. It systematizes and extends that material in ways that reflect Ibn Sina's own observations and reasoning, and it includes detailed discussions of conditions and treatments that go beyond what Greek medicine had described. His classification of mental conditions, including something recognizable as what we might now call depression, and his discussion of what he calls lovesickness, as a genuine medical condition deserving of medical treatment rather than simply moral correction, are examples of original thinking that entered the European tradition and stayed there. The translation movement of the 12th century centered on Toledo in Spain and on Palermo in Sicily, where Christian, Muslim and Jewish scholars worked together producing Latin translations of Arabic texts that were themselves often translations or reworkings of Greek originals, is one of the most consequential intellectual projects in the history of science. It brought into the European tradition not just the Greek text that Europe had lost, but the Arab commentary and extension of those texts, producing a synthesis that was considerably richer than anything purely Greek or purely Arabic alone. The European medical schools that emerged in the following century were drawing on this synthesized tradition, and they knew it, citing their sources across linguistic and cultural boundaries with a scholarly promiscuity that the later history of European intellectual life would not always sustain. The Jewish medical tradition is one of the threads most thoroughly erased from the standard narrative of medieval medicine, despite the fact that Jewish physicians were prominent throughout the Mediterranean world and into Northern Europe, and despite the fact that Jewish scholarship produced significant medical figures whose work influenced both the Arab and the Christian traditions. Maimonides, working in the 12th century, was a physician as well as a philosopher and legal scholar, and his medical writings, which include a collection of aphorisms organised by topic and several specialised treatises, are both learned and practical, drawing on the full range of available sources while adding clinical observations that are clearly his own. His advice on diet, exercise, sleep, and emotional management for the maintenance of health is recognisable to any reader of modern preventive medicine, stripped of the humoral framework that surrounds it. The question of women's access to medical knowledge and practice in the medieval period is complicated and has been the subject of significant scholarly debate. The famous Trotula of Salerno, a collection of texts on women's medicine and cosmetics associated with Salerno from the 11th and 12th centuries, was long attributed to a historical female physician named Trotula, though modern scholars have established that the texts are composite and the attribution uncertain. What is clear is that Salerno had a tradition of women's medical involvement, and that the Trotula texts represent genuine knowledge about gynecological and obstetric medicine that was being transmitted in written form, which is unusual. Most of the practical knowledge about women's bodies and their care was transmitted through the informal networks of midwives, wise women, and experienced mothers, and most of that knowledge was not written down at all. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive, and most of that knowledge was not written down at all. The women who practiced healing without formal credentials in the medieval period, and there were many of them, operating in every community with varying degrees of skill and local acceptance, existed in a legal and institutional grey area that periodically darkened. The periodic crackdowns on unlicensed medical practice that municipal authorities undertook in the later medieval period were targeted partly at fraudulent practitioners and partly at women whose authority, derived from experience rather than credentials, was considered suspect in itself. A woman who healed people effectively had, by the logic of some authorities, done so through means that required investigation. A woman who healed people ineffectively was simply incompetent. This was not a framework designed for fairness. And yet the practice continued, because the formal system could not cover the actual need. There were never enough licensed physicians to serve the full population. The cost of their services was beyond the reach of most ordinary people, and the specific knowledge that women practitioners held about women's bodies and women's conditions was simply not available through the male-dominated official system. The survival of this informal practice under various pressures and in various conditions is evidence of the gap between what the official medical system could provide and what people actually needed, a gap that was managed not by expanding the official system, but by tolerating the informal one even while formally disapproving of it. The children who died in the medieval period without ever receiving any medical attention at all are perhaps the most important silent presence in any account of medieval medicine. Child mortality was extreme by modern standards. A significant proportion of children born in the medieval world did not survive to adulthood, taken by the respiratory illnesses, the gastrointestinal infections, the fevers, and the accidents that a world without vaccines, without clean water, without antibiotics, and without any real understanding of infant nutrition was powerless to prevent. The medicine that existed did what it could, which was occasionally something and often not enough, and the gap between what existed and what was needed was filled by grief. The grief of parents losing children in the medieval period has left traces in the historical record that challenge the older scholarly view that medieval people were somehow less emotionally attached to their children because of the high mortality rates, as if frequency of loss inures against the experience of losing. The archaeological record of children's graves, found with toys and personal items, and sometimes in positions that suggest they were held after death, the occasional surviving letter from a parent describing the loss of a child, the records of votive offerings made to saints in hopes of healing a sick child, these are not the record of people who cared less because they expected more. The physician who came to your bedside when you lay feverish and watching the knot in the ceiling beam would have seen many children die. He would have sat at small bedsides with his urine flask and his pulse examination and his humoral diagnoses and prescribed his cooling foods and his theriac, and sometimes watched the breathing ease and the fever lift, and sometimes watched neither of those things happen. He had no way of knowing which case would go which way. He had his theory and his training and his genuine desire to help, and the specific courage that it takes to sit with the seriously ill and do what you can while knowing that what you can do has limits you cannot fully see. That courage is real regardless of whether the theory is correct. The willingness to attend, to examine, to engage with suffering as something to be addressed rather than endured in isolation is not a function of theoretical correctness. It is a human response to human need, and it was present in medieval medicine alongside all the wrongness, the bloodletting and the urine wheels and the zodiac charts and the dried viper flesh in the theriac jar. The patient lying in the sick room was not simply being failed by an inadequate system. They were also being attended to by a system that cared in the particular and limited ways available to it, which is not nothing, and which in some cases was enough. The legacy that medieval medicine left to the world that came after it is not primarily a legacy of correct answers. It is primarily a legacy of sustained engagement with the questions. The intellectual infrastructure of medical education, the university system, the written tradition, the systematic training of practitioners, the insistence that medicine was a discipline that required formal study and could not simply be improvised from intuition. All of this was built in the medieval period and passed forward intact into the scientific revolution and beyond. The questions that Galen's text encoded, even wrongly, organised centuries of investigation. The gaps in the theory, the cases that did not behave as the theory predicted, the observations that did not fit the framework, these accumulated into the pressure that eventually forced the framework to change. And there is one more thing worth saying before we move toward rest. The people inside the medieval medical system were not waiting to be rescued by modernity. They were living their lives, treating their illnesses, caring for their sick, dying and recovering and doing what they could with what they had. They were not aware of their own limitations in the way that historical hindsight makes them visible. They were doing medicine. Their medicine was imperfect, as all medicine is, as it continues to be, as it will probably always be, because the body is more complicated than any given theory of it, and the gap between what is known and what is true narrows in each era without ever closing entirely. The patient who recovered from the fever, who ate the soup and followed the diet and took the theriac and lay in the sick room watching the afternoon light move across the ceiling, was doing something genuinely ancient and genuinely human. They were submitting to the care of their community, trusting the best available framework, waiting for their body to do what bodies do, and recovering. Not because medieval medicine was correct, because the body is resilient, and because people were kind, and because sometimes those two things together are what is needed. Which brings us gently and finally to the end of tonight's journey through the strange and serious world of what it meant to be sick, to be a healer, to be a searcher, and to be a system of knowledge doing its best at the edge of what was knowable. Tonight we began with a fever, with a person lying on a straw mattress watching the ceiling and learning, unwillingly and specifically, what it felt like to be a patient in the medieval world. What it felt like to have your urine examined by a man with complete confidence in what it told him. What it felt like to have your arm opened with a lancet and to feel your blood collected in a bowl. What it felt like to be prescribed a remedy that contained dried vipers and opium and honey, and to drink it without entirely understanding any of those things, because the framework that explained it was not yours, and the language it was written in was not yours, and the trust required was simply the trust of someone who had no other option. We moved from that bed to Hildegard of Bingen, who never lay still in a bed for long if she could help it, who spent 80 years insisting on things that people told her were impossible, and who kept turning out to have been right, not always, not in every detail, but in the things that mattered most, in the insistence that the natural world was full of medicine if you looked at it carefully enough, in the attention she brought to the connection between the life of the mind and the health of the body, in the music that she believed worked on the body through the body and that still does something to the people who listen to it that they find difficult to name. We visited the apothecary's counter, where the official medical knowledge and the informal practical knowledge met across a wooden surface, where prescriptions in Latin were translated into preparations in stone mortars, where the woman who came for pennyroyal was served without explanation, where the midwife's experience and the shopkeeper's training compared notes at the end of a long day, and where the stain on the fingertips told its own story about the intimate relationship between knowledge and practice, between what is written and what works. And we examined the system itself, the official image of a complete and confident medicine drawn from the deepest wells of ancient authority, and the reality behind that image, which was more impressive and more limited than the simplified story allows, which contained genuine knowledge embedded in wrong theory, genuine care operating alongside genuine failure, genuine curiosity pushing against the boundaries of what the available tools could reach. The people in all of these stories were doing what people do. They were working with what they had. They were trying to understand what they encountered. They were helping where they could and failing where they could not, and they were passing on what they learned to the next generation. Imperfectly, but consistently enough that something real accumulated century by century toward what came after. There is something restful in that accumulation, if you let yourself feel it. The long, slow building of human understanding, which moves in the wrong direction as often as the right one, which contains as much error as insight, which is always partial and always limited, and always, somehow, also always moving. The fever breaks eventually. The body does its work. The barley water sits by the bed. Someone keeps bringing it. And that is enough. That has always been enough. Close your eyes now. The history is very old and very human, and it will be here in the morning. Let it rest beside you like a tired traveller who has come a very long way and has more still to go, but not tonight. Not tonight, tonight rest. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.